Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you feeling? Yeah, good? Excellent. Now, I'm going to presume, seeing as there's not a clicker here waiting for me, that someone's going to press next slide every time I call for that. Yeah? Fantastic. Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, the subject of the talk today being Black history as the lost pages of human history. Actually, the quote itself comes from the great Pan-Africanist historian, Dr. John Henrik Clarke, who spoke about Black history in this way and looked at the way in which the history of people of African descent and of Africa itself had to be functionally distorted to justify transatlantic slavery and colonialism in a way that we kind of can't fully comprehend or understand today. If we think about a time just over 100 years ago when African human beings were literally kept in zoos in London, in New York, in Paris, that gives us a sense of the strength of colonial propaganda and how deeply it had taken root in this society and others, to the point that it was actually argued by hard science, by people who considered themselves serious academics, that black people were more closely related to monkeys than to other human beings. But what we know, just as we can see today, that dishonest scholarship can be a tool for profitable foreign policy, so is the case in the past. I think a lot of the time we're led to believe that people actually believed the propaganda of the time, those scholars we're talking about. When we know, just as we can see today, people have more knowledge about what's going on in some country in Africa or Asia that we might be preparing to go to war with, so did they know more back then than we're led to believe. There was no magical time when people who really had knowledge about the world didn't know what was really going on the ground. History was distorted deliberately in particular ways, and that legacy is still with us in many ways, to the point that even for someone like me, who I'd like to feel lots of my followers are socially engaged, know about the world, when I post pictures, I was in Zimbabwe a couple of weeks ago, this just gives you an example. When I post pictures of the capital city of Zimbabwe, Harare, and they've got skyscrapers and nice hotels and the beautiful jacaranda trees, if you've ever been to Harare, you'll know this. Nice restaurants, people are like, wow, they've got skyscrapers in Africa. I don't know if people think people in Africa still live in mud huts. I don't know if people believe, as you're going to see over the next half an hour, there was ever a time when everyone in Africa lived in mud huts. But the strength of propaganda, even for people of African origin, is still with us to that point that we have this thing called Black History Month. Now, for those who don't know, the idea for Black History Month was invented or came up with by an African-American scholar called Carter G. Woodson. He wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro, which looked at the way in which African-Americans had to be functionally miseducated for transatlantic slavery and then the subsequent Jim Crow apartheid to function in America. But I would take what Woodson was saying, although I agree with him one step further, and I would say that for racism to function in human society, full stop, everyone has to be functionally miseducated about the human story. And no part of the human story, in my view, has been more distorted than the history of the African continent and then its descendants. So I'm going to try and share, in half an hour, tens of thousands of years of history with you very quickly, some of the snapshots of what we should be teaching. Because if we're not careful, what happens is Black History Month comes around and we do exactly what it was not supposed to be intended to do. We subtly reinforce the idea, which was argued by serious historians at one point, that Africa has no history, by teaching transatlantic slavery and Martin Luther King. And with the greatest of respect to Dr. King, brave and courageous as he was, I'm fairly sure if he was alive today, he would go spare at the idea that he was the sum total of black people's contribution to the human story. So it's important that we look at what we should be teaching during this month to correct some of these misconceptions, because people cannot be blamed for their ignorance if they are genuinely ignorant. People can be blamed if they've had a different set of information and still choose to remain ignorant. So can I go on to the first slide, please? This is where I've chosen to start the story. We could have started the story, anthropologists are still telling us, that the oldest human remains ever found are in Africa, that we are all common ancestors of the Ethiopian Australopithecus called Lucy, or Dinquinesh. But I've chosen to start the story here. For those who don't know, the Sahara was not always a desert. So it expands and contracts, in my basic geological understanding. As the rains migrated south, the Sahara expanded. When those tropical rains migrate back north, the Sahara contracts. Over thousands of years, this process goes. So across the Sahara, all across North Africa, we find some of the oldest cave art in human history. Pictures like this, all across North Africa. Next slide, please. We also find many, many examples of this. This is an astronomical observatory. In this case, arguably the oldest astronomical observatory in the history of humanity. Scholars believe somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 BC. So possibly as old as 11,000 years ago, two American physicists called Thomas Brophy and Robert Bauval wrote a fantastic book called Black Genesis, looking at the relationship between this astronomical observatory and the evolution of the ancient Egyptian religion and subsequent civilization. Next slide, please. Which brings us on to the first point of contention in ancient African history. Can you see here, for anyone who didn't see this film, and I didn't see this film, I'm not in the habit of watching propaganda, that Hollywood is trying to convince us that in ancient Northeast Africa, Anglo-Saxons were the ruling elite. People that look like Christian Bale. Now, for anyone who saw the film, which I didn't, but people told me, in this film, all the slaves and the servants were black. Now, for anyone who understands the way film and TV works, that doesn't happen by accident. There's a thing called a casting agent, and a casting agent decides who's going to get what roles. So some casting agent said, the ruling elite in ancient Egypt are all going to be white, and the slaves and the servants are all going to be black. We're going to project apartheid South Africa back 5,000 years into North African history. How accurate is this picture of ancient Egypt? Let's see. Next slide, please. Follow a little more. National Geographic Channel. This image here of King Tut. I don't know why we need a scientific reconstruction of King Tut. We have copious amounts of carvings and paintings of King Tut from his actual life, but apparently this is a French reconstruction based on his skull. This is apparently what King Tut looked like. We're going to see how inaccurate that is in a minute. On the other cover, this was an article that came out a couple of years ago called Black Pharaohs, Conquerors of Ancient Egypt. And essentially what the article said, which is the revised new propagandistic position in relation to ancient Northeast Africa, aka ancient Egypt, that black pharaohs came into ancient Egypt right at the end of the civilization in the 25th dynasty, and they conquered Egypt, and because of racism, no one's ever told their story till now. But guess what? We're here to tell you that in the 25th dynasty, 3,000 years after the founding of ancient Egypt, black people finally got involved in the game. And the only people that believe different are crazy Afrocentric black people trying to make themselves feel better. This is almost exactly what the article says, even though I'm, of course, being sarcastic. Let's again see how accurate that is. Next slide, please. Now, this is the British reconstruction of Tutankhamun, based on the same skull. Can you see that if the French and the British were both using scientific techniques, how come the British scientists came up with this, and the French ones came up with one that looks French? Next slide, please. But again, there's no need. This is Tutankhamun in his own life. We've got to make up our mind. Was he jet black or was he red? Now, if you know much about ancient Egyptian art, or even ancient Nubian art, you will know that red was a symbolic color. I don't know what it meant, and we don't know what it meant, but all throughout ancient Northeast African history, even among the Igbos in Nigeria, you find in their art, men painted red, women painted yellow. I've seen this in Nubian temples. No one's arguing that that meant the Nubians were red. Of course, there are Africans, like Somalians and Eritreans, that have a dark red complexion. They're just as African as anyone from Nigeria. But Tutankhamun clearly couldn't have been both red and black. So we need to figure out which one he was. Next slide, please. Now, no one disputes these invasions. Okay? When we talk about who the ancient Egyptians were, there's consensus that Egypt has been invaded over half a dozen times. I haven't even included in this list the Ottoman invasion, I haven't included the French or the British invasion, that all came after this. But the Arab invasion in the 7th century of the Common Era, then the Vandals, which is where the word vandalism came from, because they was a bit mad, to use the technical term. That came in the 5th century. They are German people. Then the whole of North Africa, not just Egypt, was a Roman province. Before that, Greek. Before that, Persian in 525 BC. At the most conservative estimate, ancient Egyptian history, pharaonic kingship, begins in 3100 BC. I say most conservative because I don't actually agree with that chronology, because my teacher, Robin Walker, big shout out to the OG, taught me that there's reasons to disagree with that chronology. But nonetheless, if we go with the most conservative estimate, can we see that the Persians still got to Egypt 2,500 years after the founding of ancient Egyptian kingship? So who was living in Northeast Africa prior to all of these invasions from people that are not from Africa? Well, let's see. The ancient Greeks saw the ancient Egyptians for themselves. They were in Egypt during the Persian invasion, and of course, then when they ruled Egypt for a little while. Let's see what some of them had to say. Next slide, please. Diodorus of Sicily. General Histories, Book 3, 30 BC. Now the Ethiopians, for those who don't know, Ethiopian literally means of the burnt face. It wasn't an insulting term, it was a generic term for black person, yeah? Back in the day, and it referred to generally all of Africa, and even the Greeks used it to refer to parts of India. If you go to India today, in southern India, you'll find people, some people, as black as any people in Africa. So it shouldn't surprise you if that term was used, but it was a generic term meaning black. Now, the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men. The proofs of this statement, they say, are manifest. They also say the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians. Now, can you see, we're told modern science discovered that Africans were the first people on the planet. But here is an ancient Greek historian saying that Africans were already saying we were the first people on the planet in 30 BC. Herodotus, the father of history, There can be no doubt but that the Colchians are an Egyptian race. Before I heard any mention of the fact from others, I had remarked it myself. My own conjectures were founded on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair, afro. Yeah? The Colchians, by the way, are a group of people in southern Russia at the time. Whole host of other Greek scholars, including Aristotle, and there's loads more I could have put, seemed very unconfused about the ancient Egyptians' ethnicity. We can't have it both ways. Either the ancient Greeks were one of the most intelligent, civilized people ever, or they were so stupid they couldn't recognize the colors of people they saw for their own eyes. But we can't have it both ways, you see? Next slide. Now, here are some Egyptologists. It's important for us to understand the way early Egyptology evolved. When the French came to Egypt and colonized Egypt, it was in the height of transatlantic slavery, late 1700s, Napoleonic expedition to Egypt. The Sphinx, the pyramids, all of these things are newly rediscovered. And immediately the French are like, uh-oh, we've got a bit of a problem here because we have an economy based on the pseudoscientific idea of racism, based on the idea that some races, namely the white race, an invention, is superior to other races, particularly the black. And the discovery of an ancient African civilization, thousands of years before there was anything of comparable stature in France or England, not an insult, just a fact of history, created some problems. Now, some scholars immediately reacted to this by saying, okay, well, clearly racism's nonsense. Hooray, we can do away with such a stupid idea. Of course, foreign policy realized this wasn't terribly convenient if your economy depends on racialized slavery. So even though some honest scholars came out and told the truth, many scholars went against this, and you're going to see how ridiculous some of the explanations got. So C.F. Vonley, a man who wrote a fantastic book called The Ruins of Empires, had the following to say. He made many other comments, direct comments about the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians. This is one particular comment, one of my favorite. He said, "There are a people now forgotten, discovered, while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences, a race of men," now, of course, like most sexist men, he used men, but he meant all humans, because we just normalize that kind of language, men to represent all of humanity, now rejected from society for their sable skin and frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe. Champollion, not the main Champollion, but the brother of Francois Champollion, had the following to say. I'm not going to read it all, but if you look closely, he says that Vonley's basically chatting rubbish. There's no way the ancient Egyptians could have been black. But let's get to the end, and this is how funny it is. Listen to this part. Vonley invokes that of Herodotus, who recalls that the Colchians had black skin and woolly hair. Yet these two physical qualities, black skin and afro hair, do not suffice to characterize the Negro race, and Vonley's conclusion as to the Negro origin of the Egyptians is evidently forced and inadmissible. Now, he didn't offer any evidence. All he said was having black skin and woolly hair doesn't make you black. And if we go back into the racial science of the day, you will understand that it was actually argued by otherwise intelligent people that there were two races of black people. There were Negroes and there were Hamites. Hamites were any Africans that didn't look absolutely stereotypically what we think of West African people to supposedly look like. Anyone that has a slightly thin nose or any kind of straight hair or any features randomly that we decide was a Hamite. And Hamites were responsible for all of the civilization in Africa, and they descended from Europeans. Negroes, on the other hand, they were the real black people. And even when we find evidence of Negroes, we'll just say they were Hamites, as you have here. This is how silly and how ridiculous ideas, pseudo-scientific ideas like race, make otherwise intelligent people behave. Next slide, please. Again, two early Egyptologists saying very much the same thing. Egyptian civilization is not Asiatic, but African in origin, of Negro origin. However paradoxical this may seem, we are not accustomed, in fact, to endow the black or related races with too much intelligence. So Professor Abiy Amelou straight away hit on what the issue was. Francois Champollion, the founding father of Egyptology, the man who decoded the Rosetta Stone, what did he have to say? Because apparently, according to National Geographic, the only people that think the ancient Egyptians were black were crazy Afrocentric black people. But let's see. The Egyptians belonged to a race quite similar to the Kenuas, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, or Barbarous, present inhabitants of Nubia, Sudan. In the present Copts of Egypt, we do not find any of the characteristic features of the ancient Egyptian population. The Copts are the result of crossbreeding. Seems normal when a country gets invaded, there's interbreeding. The people that live in America today are not representative of the ancient indigenous Americans for the most part. Even though those people still live there, the average citizen of New York does not look like the average American 500 years ago. With all the nations that successively dominated Egypt, i.e. the Greeks and Romans, it is wrong to seek in them the principal features of the old race. And I could go on ad infinitum of Egyptologist after Egyptologist who, even if they felt compelled to racially abuse the ancient Egyptians, which many of them did, some of the art historians talk about how can you ever say their carvings are nice when they're so obviously Negro. Many of them, scores of them are like, well, obviously they were black, that's why they were uncivilized. So Egyptologists were presented with this real problem. Either ancient Egypt was civilized and European, or uncivilized and African. And very few of them acknowledged that it was both highly civilized, highly technically advanced, and also African, but a few of them did. Next slide, please. This is the first pharaoh of ancient Egypt. The man who united the two lands. He came from what we call Upper Egypt. Now, to understand Upper Egypt is Lower Egypt to us. Upper Egypt is the portion of Egypt closest to Sudan, not closest to the Mediterranean. And the early kings of Egypt came from this region of Egypt. This is Narmer Menes carrying that stereotypical Negro face that we were told in old pseudoscience made a person inherently inferior. Next slide, please. 2,000 years later, in the tomb of Ramesses II, is this. This is reproduced by 2 European Egyptologists whose names are at the bottom. And this is what we call today the portrait of the races. This is how the ancient Egyptians in 1200 BC, so 2,000 years later than the founding of their kingdom, saw the different groups of the world, according to the hieroglyphics. Figure A is the ancient Egyptians as they saw themselves. Can you see? It goes right along with what the early Egyptologists thought. It goes right along with what the ancient Greeks thought. No one needs to be confused about what they look like. And in fact, it looks a lot like the picture of Tutankhamun we just saw. So that's how they saw themselves. They didn't seem to be particularly confused about their ethnicity. Figure B is Indo-European people. Figure C is other blacks of Africa, presumably the Nubians, who were the main people that the ancient Egyptians had as rivals. I don't want to give you the impression that there was this magical time in black African history where all black people just got along and bogled and sang Kumbaya together. That isn't how things go in real history, right? Because what some pseudo-Egyptologists have tried to do is said, but the Egyptians fought the Nubians, so they couldn't have been black. Okay. So what, all black people have just always got along then, apparently. Okay. Figure D is Semitic people, people in the Middle East. Now, can you see that the only difference between figure A and figure C is one of swagger? Figure A has 3 stripes, and figure C has 2. Other than that, they're exactly the same. Next slide, please. Now, what you'll notice a lot with ancient Egyptian carvings, and I don't believe it's quite ever got to the bottom of who was behind this all, but we have to understand this in context. The Sphinx has no nose on it, and the Sphinx has a very stereotypical Negro face. We have to understand the level of hatred that was being dealt with when early Egyptology evolved, and we start seeing all these granite statues that are otherwise perfect. Now, granite is a very tough substance, but their noses are just missing, and no one wants to explain why the noses went missing. But viewed in the context of the time and the offense that the idea that Negroes could have created such a magnificent ancient civilization would have caused, it seems fairly clear where some of this malicious behavior could have easily come from. Next slide, please. We just see loads of ancient Egyptian statues, they just ran into the wall and their nose just came off. Next slide, please. Can you see a lot of my Rasta brethren think that Rastas invented dreadlocks? Here is a gentleman clearly with dreadlocks, a few thousand years before the Common Era. Next slide, please. More noses missing. Next slide, please. More noses missing. Next slide. Thankfully, not all of the noses are missing. These are some heads from Tanite. Can you see? More dreadlocks. These are not the ones that often get displayed in museums. Often what's displayed in museums can be the most, or what is perceived to be the most European-looking ancient Egyptian carving. So you'll see Nefertiti everywhere. But we know Nefertiti's dad wasn't African. It's not surprising that Nefertiti was light-skinned and she looked a certain way. If you don't know that history, someone's going to say to you, this is Nefertiti. She's representative of what all the ancient Egyptians look like. Can you see how you'd be confused? Next slide, please. And of course, let me be clear, that's not me saying the ancient Egyptian population was in no way mixed. That would also be ridiculous. Ancient Egypt was a mega civilization. Like any civilization, it would have attracted immigration, it attracted invasions several times in its history. I'm not saying every single ancient Egyptian had totally jet black skin, because there's no way for me to know that. What I'm saying is, they definitely didn't look like Christian Bale. This is the Pharaoh Doza. Next slide, please. This is the Pharaoh Khufu. This is the gentleman for whom the Great Pyramid was commissioned. Again, just look at his face for yourself. Make your own decision on what you think he's likely to have looked like based on the evidence of people that carved him in his own time. Next slide, please. And the issue here is really the human story. In the Enlightenment, the idea that Europe had basically been responsible for everything positive in the entire human story, as ridiculous as that may seem to us now living in the 21st century, with the return of Chinese power, with the Indian mission to Mars, with all of these things that are going on, and it's clear how much the world is changing before us, it should be fairly obvious to anyone with half a brain that no one group of humans is responsible for everything wonderful that's ever happened, or all of scientific progress, or all philosophy. But 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that was considered a hard scientific idea, considered so normal that very few people even questioned that. And those European scholars which did question it, I could name some of them, probably no one in this room's heard of them. Have you ever heard of a man called Gerald Massey? He spent 36 years of his life writing a companion to Darwin's theory of evolution, working class white Englishman who taught himself to read, brilliant scholar, spent 36 years of his life writing a companion that tried to prove that not only humanity evolved out of Africa physically, but also culturally, spiritually, philosophically. He literally wrote 6 volumes. I have them on my shelves like that. Even though he was an Englishman, the only people today that read or publish his books are crazy Afrocentric black people. So it's very funny. I'm going to continue with that. So the human story is not the monopoly of one particular group of people. And even though the ancient Greeks, this has been one of the controversial areas, a scholar called Martin Bernal from Cambridge wrote a book called Black Athena in the 80s, which received a lot of attention, a lot of criticism, a furor around the book, partly because he was a Cambridge-educated scholar, partly because of who his family were. His granddad was an Egyptologist. But nonetheless, some people might feel that he overstated the case of Egypt's influence on Greece. But the Greeks themselves said, yeah, some of us went to study in Egypt, no big deal, as you can see here. And thus, Egypt was the cradle of the mathematical arts. Can you see, coming from Aristotle, that's a big compliment. There's another quote from Aristotle, I'll paraphrase, but he's basically insulting the ancient Egyptian priests because they wouldn't give him all of their secrets. He's acknowledging they had knowledge they would not share with him. And he insults them for it, not something we look at today. They had a value for pi of 3.16, which with no calculators, thousands of years ago is pretty impressive. I must point out that value is on a papyrus reed that we know is a child's school textbook. So we don't know whether or not they got a more accurate figure for pi, but we know that a high school student could work out pi to 2/100ths of a decimal place. The so-called Pythagorean theorem, 365-day calendar based on astronomical observation. They also had another calendar which took account of the leap year, but it didn't do it in the way we do it. It basically let the leap year run alongside. They understood that the year was 365 and a quarter days long, and they just let the quarter days add up until it came back round. I think it's 1460 years till it would come back round and the years would link up again, and they had a big festival. They understood the concept of the month and the zodiac based on groupings of stars. They pioneered heliocentric theory and the concept of the atom, not according to Akala, but according to Isaac Newton. So if you've got beef, take up the beef with Isaac Newton. They knew of the planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter, calculated and predicted lunar eclipses, medical specialization. Back then, including, if you put into your internet search, a word called Pesheshet, which is spelt exactly as it sounds, you will see that there was a government position called the Chief of Female Physicians. One of the fascinating things about ancient Egypt was the role women played in the society. I'm not going to come here and pretend to you that it was a feminist paradise, but what we do know is there were 5 female pharaohs. Women could inherit and bequeath property, and of course, we had female physicians. Medical specialization, shipbuilding and expeditions, copious amounts of literature in poetry and prose has survived. There is 3 great volumes of ancient Egyptian literature published by a scholar called Mary Lichtenheim. I suggest you look them up, in addition to the coffin texts and the pyramid texts and others. Next slide, please. This is Imhotep. Has anyone seen the film The Mummy Returns? Can you see that this real Imhotep doesn't look much like the Imhotep in The Mummy Returns? And he is quite arguably the first polymath, the first multi-genius recorded in human history. The same 2 American physicists I mentioned earlier, Thomas Bouval and Robert Brophy, or Robert Bouval and Thomas Brophy, I always get their names confused. They wrote a book on Imhotep's work. But he designed the oldest pyramids still standing in Egypt, the oldest medical books in human history. He wrote, of course, someone may have wrote medical books before him, but the oldest surviving we have. So we could properly call him the father of medicine. We currently call Hippocrates the father of medicine, but Hippocrates was born 2,000 years later. Next slide, please. But I don't want to give you the impression, as some people try to, that ancient Egypt was all that happened in Africa. And even some, people considered Afrocentric can overstate the case and act like ancient Egyptian civilization, impressive as it was the only civilization that occurred in Africa. It wasn't even the oldest kingdom in Africa. The oldest kingdom in Africa would be in what today, that we know of, would be in what today is Sudan, a place called Kutsul. They call it the land of the bow. About 2 to 3 centuries before the rise of ancient Egypt, just as you can see, it concurs with what the ancient Greeks said about ancient Egyptian civilization coming from inner Africa, concurs with many other forms of evidence. At a place called Kutsul, there was the first kingdom, recognized kingdom in Africa, and it had many of the symbols that would later go into Pharaonic Egypt. So it was in many ways a precursor to Pharaonic Egypt. But there have been many stages of civilization in Sudan that started before and proceeded to after the fall of formal pharaonic civilization. So if we fast forward a little bit, next slide please, and again, we see pyramids like this. I've been here. There are more pyramids surviving in Sudan than there are in Egypt, 223 in all, though they are not as old as the ones in ancient Egypt. These are of a later date. These ones are from about 100 BC. Next slide, please. Then if we go forward, there was a Christian empire in Sudan. This is a reconstruction by a Polish archaeologist of a Christian church from 1000 AD rather. Yeah, again, pretty impressive. Based on the remains, this is what it would have looked like. Next slide, please. Fast forward to Ethiopia. Now this, I always show people this and I usually ask, what is unusual about this building? But we haven't got time for the quiz. It usually takes people a little while to figure it out. But it's not technically a building. It's a carving. The architect and the builders of this 800-year-old church have dug down into the ground and carved the building out of the mountain. Next slide, please. And that's what it looks like inside. Okay, see, that's quite impressive for 800 years ago. Quite beautiful. Next slide, please. This is a stele, weighs 450 family-sized cars, the equivalent of 300 tons. We don't actually know how 2,000 years ago, people in Ethiopia managed A, to carve this block of granite, and B, to get it to stand up without a crane. And can you see, if you look closely, it's imitating a multi-story building. I can't say that they had multi-story buildings, but there's a door at the bottom, and there's what are clearly floors and the imitation of windows going up to the top. Nonetheless, it's fairly impressive to get a 300-ton block of granite to stand up without a crane. And it isn't even the largest stele found in Ethiopia in this time. The largest one found weighs 500 tons, so almost double, but it's no longer standing. Next slide, please. Now, if I showed you these castles at the beginning of this presentation, and we didn't know this was a presentation on African history, we'd probably assume these were in England or Scotland or Norway, but these are Ethiopian castles from the 17th century. Next slide, please. We get to Western Central Africa. This is the heart of where Africans were supposed to display their innate inferiority, because this is where most of the enslaved Africans enslaved in the Americas were taken from. And what do we have here? In 1668, a Dutchman called Olfert de Poor traveled around Central and Western Africa, and he drew some pictures. This is a picture from what today would be Nigeria, the Kingdom of Benin. In 1668, you can see the procession of the king. You can see multi-story buildings in the background. And if you look really closely, even though it's quite small for some of you at the back, you can see the city in the background. It has a wall around the outside of it. This wall, the Great Wall of Benin, is in the Guinness Book of World Records, 1974 edition, as the largest earthworks carried out prior to the mechanical era. It's estimated that the wall at its height may have been as much as 10,000 miles of walling. I didn't start or make a mistake. Go and take up the beef with the archaeologists. Next slide, please. This is the city of Luango in the Kingdom of Congo. Same year, drawn by the same guy. We can see clear evidence of urban planning, straight streets, terrace housing, multi-story buildings, again a wall around the entire outer city with gates in it. This particular state was almost like a sort of early client state of the Portuguese. For 2 centuries they'd already been trading at this point ivory and pepper with the Portuguese, and this empire had an embassy in Rome during this period. Not something we learn about or taught about too tough. Next slide, please. This is the city of Agades in the Empire of Songhai, which would be in the country Niger today. This city at its height, this is again drawn by a European traveller called Dr. Henry David Bath, had 70,000 people living there in the 16th century. 20,000 to 30,000 people lived in London in the 16th century. So that gives you a sense of how quickly history can evolve. London was the largest city in the world 150 years ago in terms of population. It isn't even close to that today. So that gives you a sense of how quickly a major metropolis can become not the big metropolis anymore, and how a Western African city can have been bigger than London, and of course not be the case just a few centuries later. It wasn't the largest city in Western Africa at the time. The largest empire in Western Africa, or there were 4 concentric empires rather. The Empire of Ghana, which today would be in the country Mauritania, but is where the country Ghana takes its name. Then Mali, which the Empire of Mali at its height spread all the way from Senegal deep into Mauritania, 1,500 miles across, probably the most wealthy empire in African history other than ancient Egypt, and according to even mainstream scholars like Felipe Fernandez Armesto, the richest state in the 14th century world. This is one mosque/university from that empire. This particular one is the Grand Mosque of Djenné. Has anyone ever heard of a place called Timbuktu? Now, did anyone else think Timbuktu was a made-up place when they first heard of Timbuktu? I know when I was young, I thought Timbuktu was a made-up place. Turns out Timbuktu was a real place, and there's a university still standing in Timbuktu in the ancient Malian Empire, but there's good reason why we think of Timbuktu as being magical, as we're going to come to a little bit later. In the Malian kingdom, there are still 750,000 handwritten manuscripts surviving. 750,000 to this day, containing all kinds of information. Now, one of them was brought to the attention of the world by Michael Palin in a BBC program called Sahara. And he basically says, I'll paraphrase here, but he says this document, which is from the kingdom of Mali at the time, clearly shows the phases of the moon. The problem with it is that it's 150 to 200 years older than the birth of Galileo and Copernicus. So it makes us think about the entire history of science in an interesting way. Again, that's not me saying that, that's Michael Palin saying that. If you've got beef, take it up with Michael Palin. Next slide, please. South and Eastern Africa. This is what they call Great Zimbabwe, one of over 100 stone courts across southern Africa. Let's go on to the next slide. I've been here. I thought it was a bit narcissistic to include my holiday photos, so I didn't. But no, go back, please. But this outer wall is 100,000 tons of granite bricks held together without any cement. It was built in the year 1335 AD by the Shona people of Zimbabwe. Again, I have to emphasize that most of the kingdoms I'm showing you, at some point or other, some scholar somewhere argued they were not built by Africans, and this was no exception. For a long time, people were like, could have been anyone, the Chinese, Arabs, Lebanese people, Europeans, aliens, anyone but Africans. Eventually they gave up, and they was like, all right, yeah, the Shona probably built it. The most likely explanation is that the people that live there maybe built it. Next slide, please. This is a door. Now, can you see, if your front door looks like this today, life's all right for you. You're probably doing quite well. You're probably quite wealthy. This is a 700-year-old East African door from Zanzibar, from what we call the Swahili Confederacy. So there was a collection of city-states almost that spoke the language Kiswahili in East Africa that were part of a semi-global trade network. They traded with the Middle East, with India, far afield as China and the Javanese Empire. There's a fantastic book by a woman called Janet Abu-Loghold called Before European Hegemony, and it looks at the semi-global system of trade between East Africa, the Middle East, India and China at the time. And the wealth of this kingdom was part of the product of that semi-global trade system. Next slide, please. This is a house from the period. Now, can you see that other than the mold around the door, that could be a 1920s Art Deco house? And according to English Africanist scholar Basil Davidson, who's been there, I haven't been there, but this is what the writing here says of him investigating that. These houses, of course the houses of rich people living in this time, contain good internal sanitation. Next slide, please. This is a reconstruction of one of the main palaces from 1300 AD in what today would be Tanzania. Can you see the swimming pool? There was 100 rooms in here. Yeah, 1300 AD palace in Eastern Africa. Next slide, please. And then we get onto the image of black people in early Europe, which is something that's contentious because we are almost taught, even if subtly, if you watch, as I do for my sins, if you watch a TV show like Game of Thrones, even though you know it's not real history, it's still going in. And you watch Game of Thrones, and the only time black people pop up in this narrative that's supposed to sort of loosely be the human story, again, is as slaves. That isn't an accident. The casting director decided we're going to have black people and they're going to play the slaves. And, we'll get some brown people, Middle Eastern people, and they'll play Dothraki savages that eat hearts. Someone asked for that to be the case, and that's how that happens. So if you're a young person growing up and you imagine a medieval world, you don't imagine people of African descent necessarily having participated. How do I know this? When I teach Shakespeare at schools, which I often do, and I read a passage from Othello, or I read sonnets 127 to 142, where Shakespeare clearly refers to someone who's black, but everyone's avoiding that, right? Children have actually said to me, but sir, were there black people in Shakespeare's time? And I don't realize what they're saying. People in this country, in an advanced, developed, wealthy country, because they don't realize that they don't conceive even of Africans having ever existed at that time in many ways. But let's see what was actually going on in Europe. It's a gentleman called Saint Maurice. Saint Maurice was part of the Theban Egyptian legions of the Roman army. He became a saint in Christendom. These are carvings of Saint Maurice, or paintings of Saint Maurice rather, from 16th century Germany. Next slide. Again, next slide. Different saint. Saint Elesban, who was said to be an ancient Ethiopian king that had fought against Jewish people on behalf of Christendom. This particular picture of him is from Portugal, from the 1750s. Next slide. This is the giant, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but I presume it's Yasur. This is from France, and this is commemorating the battle with William of Orange in the 13th century. And this is still there in the town in France where it was painted. Again, it gives us food for thought. Next slide. But this is where it gets slightly controversial and problematic. We have these images, over 100 of them across Europe, of Madonna and Jesus depicted. Well, it speaks for itself really, doesn't it? Now, the shame of history is this. There's a fantastic blog online called Medieval POC, which deals with the role of people of color in the medieval world. You should all follow them. They're enlightening. I've learned so much from their blog. They're on Twitter and they're on Tumblr. But one of the things they pointed out to me, I can't remember which one of these Madonnas it was, but there's one that's in Poland, a really famous one. And it was restored a couple of years ago. What do you think they did during the restoration? Yeah, they painted it white. So can you see how you can be robbed of history and not even know? Noses come off, black Madonnas go white, and no one explains why. Now, if you put into an internet search engine, Isis and Horus, you might have some idea where the inspiration for this statue came from. I'll leave it at that, because that's another lecture for another day. Next slide, please. This is a European map from 1413 AD. The two gentlemen in the map, the gentleman on the left is Mansa Musa, king of the Malian Empire at its height. He is estimated by many economists today to have been the richest human that ever lived. They estimate he might have been worth as much as 400 billion in today's money. And I'm not saying that like that's necessarily a massive achievement for Africa, because one person being rich and being a king sort of probably implies some form of oppression, usually. But as far as kings go, Mansa Musa was said to have been a fairly decent king who gave away a lot of money, gold, to poor people, particularly on his pilgrimage to Mecca. He gave away so much gold in Egypt that it took 10 years for the price of gold to return to normal. That's how much gold he gave away in Egypt. And part of the mythology about Timbuktu and about this wealthy black kingdom was a result of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca and all of the rumors that spread around the world, and particularly around Europe at the time, that was going through the plague and the Dark Ages and all kind of other madness, while Mali was fairly rich. They heard about there's this African king down there past where the Moroccans live. We need to go and find that guy because he's getting some money. Now, the gentleman on the right was the ruler of the Moors. Why have I picked this particular image? Because the way that history has been racialized, even in the modern world, for those who don't know, by the way, Spain was a Muslim country for 800 years. So African and Arab Muslims colonized Spain in 711 AD until 1492, the year Columbus set sail. For 800 years, Spain was a Muslim country. No one thinks to teach us that in school. But because there was forms of race-based slavery in the Islamic world, some of the scholars have deliberately kind of distorted the history and said the only role of black people in the Islamic world, full stop, and even in Moorish Spain, was as servants and slaves, and that same history has come into play in that world, even though we know, because we have copious pictures, hundreds of pictures, I've just shown you Saint Maurice, which also means more, of rulers, of people in every position, clearly depicted as black. One only has to read Shakespeare as a fellow, and it comes very clear that who Shakespeare had in mind when he was describing Moorish people. We know that there were 4 main dynasties in Spain, and the two of the major dynasties, the Almoravid and the Almohad, were what we call Berbers. If you go to Africa today, you'll see that there are Berbers that are all kinds of mixes. The Tuareg people, for example, some of the blackest people in Africa are Berbers, as are much of the population of Morocco. So even that history has been deliberately distorted to paint away some of the role of black African people in the Islamic world. Next slide, please. Now, this is the most contentious and controversial part of the lecture. And this is the part where I think there's some room to have some fun and for us to contemplate things that are considered outrageous. A scholar called Ivan van Sertima wrote 2 books. One called They Came Before Columbus, and one called Early America Revisited. And both these books, but particularly the first one, received a lot of criticism and a lot of praise. It was a very polarizing work, because he suggested that Africans sailed to America before Christopher Columbus. Now, I've read a lot of the critiques of his work, and I'll be honest with you, most of the critiques I've read to this point, and I'd be happy to see a better one, have either just lied about what he said. They've said that he said all the Olmecs were Africans. He never said that. They've said that he said Africans civilized Native Americans. Who would say such a racist, idiotic thing other than a racist idiot? He never said that. He never said that Africans founded Olmec civilization. These are all things that people said he said, and even putting quotation marks in their articles, because they knew people were not going to read Van Sertima's work. Once you labeled him a crazy Afrocentric black person, even though he's half Native American, didn't matter, job done, people were not going to read his work. Then some other critiques that I've read around his work just deal with partial pieces of the evidence in isolation and say, see, therefore he's wrong. But if you view one piece of evidence in a case in isolation, you're not building a whole case. So I'm happy to see a better, more rounded critique, but until then, I'm going to present to you some of the evidence he presents in his book. You can decide for yourself, based on the evidence in his books, if you think the position that he's put forward is rational and sensible, not based on our bias and the ridiculous idea that Africans couldn't have sailed across the ocean, but based on actual evidence. So some of the evidence he put together, shocking as it may seem, were 13 different European witnesses, including Columbus and Columbus's son. The names are all up there. You can go and check the book, check his references, who talked about seeing Africans when they got to America. Columbus particularly doesn't talk about actually seeing them himself. He talks about the indigenous people of Haiti giving him some spears that they said they traded with black people that came from the southeast. He takes them back to Spain. They're examined by the Spanish metallurgist, who concludes they were the same as the spears they were trading with Guinea. One of these scholars here, the Frenchman, Captain Calhert, explicitly refers to the Africans he saw in Panama as Mandingos, which were the people of medieval Mali. So 13 different Europeans. African oral tradition in the Malian kingdom says that King Abubakar II left, he abdicated the throne with 200 ships to sail to the great continent to the west. There are 2 contemporary Arabic documents from Egypt that tell the same story of King Abubakar II abdicating the throne and sailing to the great continent to the west. None of this conclusive yet. But here's where it gets really sticky. The Smithsonian Institute found 2 skeletons that they concluded, based on anthropological examination, to be African tropically adapted skeletons at Hull Bay in St. Thomas, dated from 1250 AD. Gets a bit problematic. On an island just close to that, they found an ancient African writing system, which I'm about to show you, called the Tifinagh script, which originates in Libya, but was also used by medieval Malians. Modern voyages on ancient crafts, so 3 different European scholars rebuilt, first of all, ancient Egyptian ships, then medieval African ships, and then one guy even sailed, the last guy in that list, Alan Lombard, sailed across the Atlantic in a raft with no supplies, just a fishing rod, and he caught rainwater. So the Atlantic is not particularly hard to cross. We know that Columbus was sailing down the coast of Africa trying to get to India, and he got caught in these currents. To assume that it's impossible for an African fisherman to have made the same mistake, let alone a royal fleet of 200 ships, seems a bit strange to me. I don't know why we would assume that. And then things got even more controversial. In 1992, the female scientist who developed the test to test hair for drugs, so that test that people still use, if you're a football player, or if you're an athlete, or if you're a prison person, they want to see if you're a prisoner and they want to see if you've been taking drugs, they examine the proteins in your hair and they can see what kind of drugs you've been taking. The woman who developed that test in 1992 found cocaine in the stomach of Ramesses II. And she was so shocked by what she found, because she knows that cocaine comes from America, she tested and retested and retested because she knew she was going to get loads of stick. Then she tested Sudanese mummies and found the same thing. And read what she said. She got hate mail, people cussing her, people were just like, what are you talking about? You're an idiot. A woman whose scientific prowess is there, is there to be attested to, but what she discovered was so upsetting for some people that she was hated on by people who, of course, are nowhere near as scientifically qualified as she is. Botany and oceanography and ceremonial and cultural correspondences between some of the stuff we're seeing in Africa and in the Americas. For example, Bart Jordan, a famous mathematical genius, child genius, who was so bright that he was given a public audience with Albert Einstein when he was just a child. This is how mathematically genius the gentleman was. He'd done a study of African pyramids, of ancient Egyptian pyramids, and Mesoamerican pyramids. According to him, not according to me, I'm not on that level mathematically. According to his study, he's like, they have to have been related, because the complex mathematical relationships to particular planets like Venus that these pyramids are built around, there's just no way. He was like, it's impossible that you would get that correlation without some sort of relationship. Again, if you have an issue with it, take it up with him. I don't have the answer, but next slide. So, here we have in Mexico, in 800 BC, cane rows. No big deal, till we turn the face round. How do we explain a face like that turning up in Mexico in 800 BC? Now, I would put it to you that if this was an overtly Chinese face, or a face that looked like a Viking, we wouldn't even have to have a debate. Everyone would be like, well, it must mean based on one face. The Vikings must have gone to America. How could you have an obviously Viking face in America unless there was Vikings there? Yet we can have a face like this, and people can honestly look at this and say, it's impossible that people of African heritage could have gone to America. Okay, and not all the Olmec heads look like that. I want to restate again, Van Serton was very clear. Not all of the Olmec heads were Africans. So pointing out that some of them don't look like Africans is irrelevant, because he was very clear that many of them are obviously not African and Native American. Next slide, please. This is the Tifinagh script that I was talking about from Hull Bay in St. Thomas. Sorry, the Tifinagh script is not in Hull Bay. It's on, does say there, Bottom Reef Bay in St. John's in the US Virgin Islands. So same collection of islands. And if you read what it says, it actually talks about ablutions. So not only is it an ancient Libyan script that we know medieval Malians used, but it makes an explicit Islamic reference. And we know that kingdom was Islamic at the time. Next slide, please. This is Mali at its height. I just wanted to show you to get a sense of just how massive it was, 1,500 miles across. And again, according to even mainstream historiography, it's now accepted that this was probably the richest state in the 14th century world. So to suggest that the richest state in the 14th century world wasn't capable of building ships and sailing the ocean seems a little odd to me. Again, I'm not saying you have to accept all of this evidence. I'm saying all I want as a counter-argument is evidence. I don't want prejudice and bias, which is what I've seen from a lot of the scholars that have counteracted Van Sertima. These carvings are from Panama and Mexico, from the 1300s. The member of the German royal family called Professor von Hottenau, who helped Van Sertima write the book, has over 100 of these carvings. They were tested by a process called fermioluminescence, which I don't scientifically understand, but apparently it's a way you date museum artifacts. Before the German museum would buy them, of course they wanted to know they were not forgeries, because some people even said, he forged them all these carvings. And then they were tested before the German museum would buy them, and they were originally owned by a member of the German royal family. How do we explain carvings like this turning up in Mexico in the 1300s? And again, and again, and again. This is my favorite one. That is a handsome face, that one, isn't it? Let's be honest. If someone's got a more logical explanation than that people that look like this were present in Mexico, I'd love to hear it. And this is the reconstruction of an ancient Egyptian papyrus ship done by Thor Heyerdahl, a Norwegian, in 1969. He went to Chad. He didn't go to Egypt, he went to Chad. And the Budumu boatmen in Lake Chad rebuilt him an ancient Egyptian papyrus ship, and he sailed from Egypt to Barbados. So we know it was physically possible. So again, we've got to digest the evidence and decide what we think based on the evidence. Until then, I'm going to agree with the American head of the Smithsonian Institute that was part of the archaeological team. In fact, he was the head of the archaeological team that digged up the Olmec heads. He said the following, and I will read it word for word. He said, Van Sertima's work is a summary of 6 or 7 years of meticulous research based upon archaeology, Egyptology, African history, oceanography, geology, astronomy, botany, rare Arabic and Chinese manuscripts, letters and journals of early American explorers, and observations of physical anthropologists. As one who has been immersed in Mexican archaeology for some 40 years and participated in the excavation of the first giant heads, I must confess I am firmly convinced of the soundness of Van Sertima's conclusions. But people would sell it to you that the only people who believe in Van Sertima are crazy Afrocentric black people trying to make themselves feel better for racism. Next slide, please. And this is the final part of my conversation with you today, because the one part of African history we do teach is, or as I prefer to call it, the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans. And usually when we teach that history, if there's anything you take away from it, growing up in the UK, it's that William Wilberforce set Africans free. There's nothing else you probably learned in school other than William Wilberforce set Africans free. I went to the National Portrait Gallery when I was a child, 7 years old, and my teacher pulled me aside and pointed at the picture of William Wilberforce and said, Kingsley, she was Canadian, this man, he stopped slavery. Now, unfortunately for my teacher, I went to a Pan-African Saturday school where we learned about the Maroons and the Haitian Revolution. So I'm 7, but I know a little history. So I'm like, miss, all by himself. You mean he helped? And she beefed me. She was like, no, Kingsley, he stopped slavery. I was like, come on, miss, stop it. So, for people who believe in freedom and democracy, as we say we do, who believe in human rights, we must understand that slavery is not new. Even though the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans may have been particularly brutal, may have gone on particularly long, may have been particularly large scale, there may have been particular features. Ancient Greece had slavery, ancient Rome had slavery, there was slavery in the Middle East, there was forced servitude in certain African empires for sure, right? Slavery is not a new thing in human history, but only once in the whole history of humanity that I know of, and that I've ever been able to find in history, have enslaved people overthrown the government and become the government themselves. Now, surely for anyone who genuinely believes in freedom and democracy and human rights, and we talk about the march toward democracy, what could be more democratic than getting rid of slavery? We want to cheer for abolitionists, but we won't cheer for enslaved people who freed themselves and became the government. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, between 1789 and 1804 in Haiti, the enslaved Africans in Haiti defeated the 3 major European empires of the time at war and declared themselves independent and the first nation to abolish slavery. I know our Prime Minister wants to keep repeating while he's visiting Jamaica that everyone in Jamaica should remember Britain's role in abolition because Britain was the first country to abolish slavery. But 1804 comes before 1807. It's just basic arithmetic. Next slide, please. Some of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, again, one of the fascinating things about history is how sexist history is, even revolutionary history. So most of the leaders we know, even from black revolutionary history, are always men. Yet we know in the Haitian Revolution, from Toussaint Louverture's own mouth, a gentleman we're going to get to in a minute, that 30% of all the fighting troops in the Haitian Revolutionary Army were women. Given that 2/3 of the people enslaved in the Americas were men, that means women were absolutely fully playing their role in the army. This is one of the leaders, Cécile Fatiman. She was what we call a Vodun priest, and her and a man called Dutty Boukman, who was also a Vodun priest and a Muslim. He was a former Maroon in Jamaica. He left Jamaica, he came to Haiti. In 1789, they staged a ceremony that was really what we see as the formal part of the Haitian Revolution. We have to understand there were hundreds of rebellions throughout transatlantic slavery, which is normal. You try to kidnap people and their children and enslave them, they're going to rebel. It's normal. And the only way to maintain slavery was through terrorism. And we can go through whole catalogues of the kinds of terrorism that we used. But in 1789, Boukman and Fatiman started a ceremony that kicked off what would become the only successful slave revolution in human history and lead to the defeat of the three major empires in Europe and the breaking of the back of the transatlantic traffic forever. Next slide, please. Another leader, female leader, Santi Belair. She's famous because when she was executed, which she was, she first of all demanded to be executed by firing squad. They were going to hang her because she was a woman. She said, no, I demand to be executed by firing squad like a man. And according to the tradition, her husband, naturally, if you're about to be killed, was a bit upset and he was crying. And she apparently slapped him and said, do you not know how sweet it is to die for liberty? Stand up. And basically her husband had to stand up and take the bullets like a man. Because we're told only men can be brave. Be like a man, don't be like a woman. Well, Santi Belair was like a man. Of course, she was really like a woman. Next slide, please. Now, the leaders that we do know, if we know anything about the Haitian Revolution, will be the following two gentlemen. This gentleman is called Jean-Jacques Dessalines. He was the man who actually led the country to independence. He was the deputy general, if you like, for most of the revolution. He was underneath the main leader, Toussaint Louverture. But he was the leader who actually took Haiti across the finish line, who fought the final battle against the French, the Battle of Vertières. And he declared the country independent in 1804. After declaring the country independent, he massacred all of the French people left on the island. What a lot of pseudo-historians have done is said he killed all the white people left on the island to try and racialize the history in a way that is not totally accurate. What they don't really want to tell you is, no, he killed all of the French people left on the island, with the active encouragement of Britain and America, who were not really getting on with France at the time. This is during the Napoleonic Wars. What's more, part of this history that we don't learn, fascinating part of the history, is that the Polish, who were part of the French army, defected from the French army and fought with the Africans against the French, against slavery. And when the revolution was over, he didn't kill the Polish. In fact, if you look at the Constitution of 1805, he done something that's very fascinating. He declared that the only ethnic identity valid in Haiti from this day forward would be black. And that even the Polish and the Germans who fought with us, from this day forward, they're black. Which I thought was fascinating as a social scientist, for someone to say, right, being black has been a badge of dishonor, has been a crime, has been something to make you a slave for all of our history on this island. Now blackness is just going to be normal. We're even going to say that white people are black. And interestingly, of course, they renamed the island Haiti after the honor of the indigenous people, because that was their name for it. Yeah, the French had called it, or the Spanish had called it San Domingo, and it had all various different European names. It's now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, by the way, because it's one island. But during colonial times, it was at various points, one side was Spanish, one side was French, then it was unified, then it split again. And this is the gentleman that everyone knows, if they do know about the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture. He was the leader for most of the revolution. All of these people I've just shown you began their life as enslaved human beings. Toussaint Louverture was a slave until he was 45 years old. But he became an educated enslaved person. He became a privileged slave, if you like. He was allowed to read. He was a coachman, which was usually a role that was reserved for mulattoes, mixed people, or for Europeans. So he began to read. And in the Bible, and in a book by a French scholar called Abby Reinau, he started reading all sorts of stories about rebellion, about revolution, about a Messiah. And he decided he was going to be that Messiah. And he became a brilliant military general, and he led the country for most of its history. Then in 1802, after the French had betrayed him many, many times, the French said, all right, come to France. Come on, we'll settle this. Come to France, we'll have a negotiation. Many of Toussaint's advisors said, Toussaint, don't go to France. You know what they're going to do. Don't go to France. But I think maybe Toussaint was tired at this point. Maybe he thought the French was going to negotiate, as they said they were going to. I don't know what he thought. But he went to France. The French put him in prison and starved him to death, because they intended to reinstall slavery, even though they said they hadn't. Fortunately for history, the French lost the final battle and slavery was outlawed in Haiti. But unfortunately, in 1825, once the different European warring powers had made up, the French threatened to re-invade Haiti. And they said, if you don't pay us back for our loss of earnings, for our loss of property, 91 million gold francs, we're going to go to war with you again. At that point, maybe Haiti wasn't in a position to go to war again. They paid back those 91 million gold francs, and it took over a century to do so. So when we talk about slavery being ancient history, well, if they started paying in 1825, I do believe it was 1947 when they finished paying that debt. Next slide, please. But one of the things that the Haitian Revolution did lead to was the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon, for those who don't know what that was, that green area was French Louisiana. That area of America was owned by the French until 1803. Napoleon had dreams of a new empire based on Haiti. Haiti at the time was the most profitable colony in the world, producing more sugar than India, producing half of all Europe's coffee. It was an incredibly profitable colony. Once Napoleon lost that colony, he had no purpose for this anymore, so he sold it to what became America. So the Haitian Revolution, a revolution on a tiny little island of enormous hemispheric importance, of enormous human importance, yet we don't learn about it. We've got to make up our mind. We're either for freedom and democracy, and we're going to celebrate movements for that, or we're not. We can't cheer for abolitionists, because their efforts would have been worthless, with the greatest of respect to them, without the revolutions that were going on in the Caribbean, and we can demonstrate that. 1804, Haitian Revolution ends. Oh, magically, 1807. Britain has an epiphany and says slavery is bad, and outlaws the transatlantic traffic. Finally, slavery itself was made illegal in Britain in 1834, or in Britain's Caribbean colonies, 2.5 years after the largest rebellion in Jamaican history. Well, what do you know? Isn't that a coincidence that the dates are always so close? 60,000 enslaved Africans in Jamaica under a man called Sam Sharp burnt down half the plantations in Jamaica, killed a whole bunch of slave masters. 500 of them were hung in revenge, but nonetheless, slavery, the back of slavery in Jamaica, in Haiti and elsewhere had been broken. There was no use for it even anymore. And of course, it wasn't central in many ways to Britain and other more industrialized countries' economies at that point. But again, that's another debate for another day. That's not to say there were not genuine abolitionists in this country, and they shouldn't be remembered. They absolutely should. But to remember abolitionists without remembering hundreds of thousands of people who physically shed their blood to free themselves seems a little bit hypocritical to me. Next slide, please. The last slide I'm going to show you for the evening before I put up a bibliography and we open up. This is the Citadel. This is a military fortification that was built in Haiti within the 15 years after it declared itself independent. I think it's incredible that a group of people who began their lives as enslaved human beings were able, for a brief period until they were extorted again, to build monuments like this. Though I must be honest to history and not romanticize history, the guy who took over, Dessalines, the man I showed you, was assassinated, by the way. When the revolution ended, he made the mistake of kind of trying to institute some kind of socialist measures in Haiti. He said to the other elite black and mulatto leaders, he said, listen, we've got all this property now. We're rich now. We've inherited what the French used to have. I think we should redistribute this property to the people who won the revolution, to the poor people, to the enslaved. The other leaders were like, no thanks, and they murdered him. And the gentleman who took over was a bit of a despot. He may have been black, but he was a black despot. And so we know that many, many Haitians died building this. So I don't want to come here and be romantic and pretend that everything was all wonderful once the revolution was won, but I am putting this up to say that I do think it's incredible as part of the human story that a group of people who'd lived most of their lives as slaves were able to construct something like this, notwithstanding, of course, the brutality that underpinned it. Here's a very brief bibliography for some of the information that I put up tonight. We'll leave this up as we open up for questions. But again, I just want to provoke you with that food for thought and look at how can we fully understand the human story in this globalized world if we don't have any real sense of major parts of it? And especially in a country like this that is becoming increasingly multicultural, especially in the city I'm from, somewhere like London, can we really justify having a curriculum in the 21st century that teaches us more about Henry VIII killing his wives than it does about, say, for example, the Peterloo Massacre? Something probably many people in this room may not have even heard of. Yeah, the Peterloo Massacre, for those who don't know, because history is, of course, not distorted just along lines of race, as I've already pointed out. It's distorted along lines of gender, but also lines of class. The Peterloo Massacre was a massacre that occurred just outside of Manchester in 1819, where 15 unarmed protesters protesting for basic parliamentary reform were hacked to death in the UK. Do you not think that would be relevant for us to know? Because many of the freedoms that we have, the right to vote, we're almost taught like we just have it because the British elite are so benevolent that they've just always given people the right to vote. In reality, even within the UK, people had to shed their blood for the very limited freedoms that people have and maybe take for granted. And so for me, with all my biases, with all my political persuasions, I would advocate for a much more revolutionary, inclusive, people-centered, global teaching of history for the world that we live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Akala. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
What do you think is the most effective way for us to replace our whitewashed version of history with a more balanced picture that includes black history? Is it by people like you kind of going around talking to as many groups as possible, or would you like to see the entire school history curriculum rewritten?
Well, I think it's important to understand. For me, I think the dichotomy of black and white can be a dangerous territory where we get into just focusing on that dichotomy rather than realizing that we need an overhaul, in my view, but again, this is based on my biases and the way I view the world. We need an overhaul generally, depending what we want the outcome to be. I don't think we should be naive. History isn't distorted by accident. What's on your curriculum isn't chosen by accident. When you watch the news, there is an editor for the news, someone who decides what will and won't make the cut. Similarly, with the design of a curriculum, someone decides what will and won't make the cut. I'm saying, based on my view of the world and what I'd like to see, I would love to see a more people-centered curriculum, full stop. In London, we have, particularly London, but UK as a whole, we have people from all over the world. We have people from every reach of the British Empire, yet no one's ever explained to people that live in this country, particularly working class people that maybe feel displaced, where all these people from India and Ghana and Nigeria and Barbados and Jamaica came from. It's just, they just came out of thin air after World War II. All of these people who we've got no idea where they came from just descended upon Britain. And if we look at the row around immigration at the moment, that's still how a lot of it is conveyed. And no one ever says, well, actually, we used to own their country and they fought for us in a couple of world wars, aside from building our economy. And actually, when my grandmother came here, she was a citizen of the British Commonwealth, traveling from one part of the British Commonwealth to another. So for me, I don't think it's just about the inclusion of black history. Personally, I think a campaign to do that would be misguided and wouldn't win. I think it's the inclusion of global history, because we live in a globalized world. And if we want our children to be able to function in a world where they might need to speak Mandarin, which is a very real economic possibility, you can see our government kissing up to China right now, right? Then we might need to teach them some things about the world. If we want to raise people that might want to go and work in Senegal or Mauritania or India, we're going to need to raise people with more awareness. But also for me, it's about human relations, and it's about a reduction of conflict. If we have an understanding of the relationship between different cultures historically, I don't think we would be so quick to support wars, to support unjust foreign policy, to view people as less than ourselves. We'd be more warm to other human beings. So absolutely, I have an agenda. I'm not coming here, I don't believe in objectivity. I think it's a made up, nonsensical idea that I can transcend my upbringing, my class, everything I've been through and just speak on behalf of Bangladeshi women because I'm so objective. No, if I want to know what Bangladeshi women think, I'll ask a Bangladeshi woman. So I am totally projecting my agenda and I own that up front. But for me, I would like to see not just black history, but world history taught. But I will add that for me, my passion for learning world history came from Pan-African Saturday School. So as a young Afro-Caribbean child growing up, if I had swallowed the Eurocentric curriculum that told me black people's only role in the human story was, first of all, as being slaves, then getting set free by William Wilberforce, and then the civil rights movement in America, I probably wouldn't have had very much pride in my own identity. Luckily, I didn't swallow that curriculum because I went to a separate Saturday school that Caribbean people set up in the 1970s. There was a big movement in the 70s where Caribbeans set up Saturday schools to A, teach black history, but also to teach maths and science, and to improve on what they felt was a racist curriculum, but also the way their children were being dealt with in the schools. I was a lucky recipient of some of that knowledge, and it meant that I didn't feel inferior to what I was being taught. So I could engage with Shakespeare or Newton or Plato, because I didn't feel intimidated by that, because I didn't feel that people like me had never contributed anything to human progress. So if we don't teach that history, many people can come to the world or come to world history with an inferiority complex that is unjustified and unnecessary.
Thank you. We're going to open up to questions from the floor. If you'd like to ask a question, please put your hand up high and wait for the microphone to come round to you. Could we start with the gentleman in the third row over there?
First of all, thank you so much. That was incredibly eye-opening.
Thank you.
I was also wondering, so a lot of these civilizations probably had their own historical records as well, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the sources that we were seeing were from Greece and some other ones. Were those systematically destroyed, or what is the situation with historical records from, say, Egypt, but also Ghana, Mali?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's 750,000 documents surviving from the Malian Empire. So those still survive today. They haven't all been translated. So the only government in Africa, unfortunately, that's put up any money to start translating them is the government of South Africa. So of course, it's a very slow process. There's 750,000 documents. But already what has emerged from that process is a book called the Tariq al-Fatash, which is a history of that area written by an African that lived in Timbuktu. So up to this point, most of the documents have been Arab observers or North African observers of West Africa or European observers, because there was a mythology that West Africa didn't have any writing. In the case of Nubia or Sudan, for example, they have a writing system called Meroitic, but it's never been deciphered, unlike the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Whereas in Ethiopia, they have their own records, those have been deciphered. They also used the Ethiopian alphabet to write Greek. We found in Sudan, in medieval Nubia, essentially writings that are in several different languages, in Greek, in Latin. So we know it was a cosmopolitan city that had relationships with the world. So there are documents, but in many cases books have been destroyed. We know the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. We know Mesoamerican documents, that doesn't relate to Africa, but we know they were massively, almost completely destroyed. So we've had to piece back the history together in a way that accounts for the fact that there's not as much written record. Despite Europe's massive amounts of wars, there's what Van Sertima calls archival continuity. We have the written documents so we can piece the history together more easily. Whereas in the case of Africa or Mesoamerica, other colonized spaces, we may have to use other forms, things like botany, things like archaeology, but the picture is still emerging. But that isn't for absence of written documents. So I want to make that clear. But ancient Egypt, of course, has some of the most copious amounts of written documents of any ancient civilization. It's just the myth that it's non-African has persisted.
Can we go to the gentleman here on the front row?
Thank you very much, first of all. I hope you forgive me for kind of tangential questions about music,
No.
About grime specifically.
Get busy.
So grime has a lot of traction at the moment,
Yeah.
Particularly in Oxford. Skepta was here at the weekend.
Yep.
And there's a lot of white people, there's a lot of public school people,
Yeah.
etc. It's sort of, very into this kind of music and sort of dressing in whatever way and, rapping and things like
Yeah.
that, to be part of a movement which they're not really part of in a socioeconomic sense necessarily. Do you think the sort of, let's say, public school, I don't want to say appropriation, but kind of enjoyment, let's say, of grime is something that is perverse? Do you think it's something that's funny? Do you think it's something that's actually progressive?
Well, I think it depends on the individual in question. I think someone enjoying another group of people's culture, there's nothing perverse about that, unless they have perverse opinions about the same group of people whose culture they're claiming to enjoy. So for example, if I don't respect your culture but I enjoy your music, if I don't respect your struggle but I enjoy your music, that's a little perverse. So if we look back in history at segregated clubs in America where the only black person allowed in the venue was the black person on stage, that's a bit problematic. In the area I live in right now, Labatt Grove, the old crack house has been turned into a club, a very snooty sort of Caribbean food serving club. And when too many black guys go there on the weekend, everyone gets uncomfortable. But it only plays reggae music and serves Caribbean food. You've got to make up your mind, which one do you want? And for me, you can't have black culture without black people. I think Notting Hill Carnival has become an example of that, where they've sort of turned it into Reading and Leeds Festival. There's nothing wrong with Reading and Leeds Festival, they're great festivals. But Notting Hill Carnival was set up directly in the wake of a racist murder of a man called Kelso Cole Crane to promote and celebrate Caribbean culture. I always give people this example. If I went to a Diwali festival, which I have done many times in the UK and in India, and everyone there was Jamaican and Rastafarian, I would complain. Not because I've got anything against Jamaican Rastafarians. I didn't go to Diwali to experience Rastafarianism. And so for me, if I go to Notting Hill Carnival and it's no longer a celebration of Caribbean culture, that isn't about hating anyone, it's about asking why this festival that was set up for specific purposes has been appropriated. So I think no matter what class you're from, you can engage in a different group of people's culture constructively, but many people don't do that. Does that make sense? And there is a particular type of performed blackness that people are willing to engage with without engaging with the oppression that has gone into creating that form. Does that make sense? So I don't think necessarily because someone happens to be wealthy and white, that means they can't engage with black culture in a constructive way. But there is certainly a condition of, I want to cherry pick the bits of blackness I'm willing to listen to and hear, and I don't really want to engage with the wider issues, and I certainly don't want to deal with what went into creating grime, because grime is an offshoot in many ways of hip-hop, even though many grime artists wouldn't admit that. Hip-hop is an offshoot of the traditions that come before it. So many of you, even the artists themselves, can feed into this shallow depiction of the culture, which can be problematic for me.
Can we go to the lady on the end, please?
Hi, Carla. On the same sort of train of thought,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the N-word and like the use of that in rap music, because obviously as a white person I've been brought up never to ever use that word, but a lot of the music I listen to says it 20 times in every song.
Yeah, for sure.
So I wanted to know what your thoughts are on that, and like whether you think it's a word that's become obsolete or whether you think that there are negative consequences on the fact that it's so widely used.
I very much do. I used to be someone who used the word all the time, as some of you may or may not know. I came to a stage in my life where one of my elders said to me, "You're better than that." And I started reading a bit more. I started studying the history of the word. I started looking at the brutality that had been underpinned by this word. Let me be clear, I'm not against people using the word. I'm just against the stupid idea that it's now become a term of endearment. It hasn't. It has so much blood attached to it. For me, it means what it's always meant. It is a term of white supremacist genocide. It is a word that says African people are not human. It was a way of reducing people to subhuman status, which led to, as I've said to you, people being put in zoos or public lynchings in America, where someone could literally be barbecued in public and people thought it was perfectly acceptable to bring their child, give their child the day off school to come and watch a person be barbecued in public. Rail systems would operate special lynching day rail cards. After the lynching, there'd be postcards with the dead person on front of it. They'd send out as souvenirs. So this is the history behind that word. If we look at early hip-hop, when hip-hop was a bit more independent, when hip-hop was owned a bit more by the black community, we see that hip-hop was completely offensive to everyone. People would say cracker, they'd say honky, they'd say nigger. You'd have Ice Cube making inappropriate songs like Black Korea. You'd have songs, NWA songs that were about killing black people. Hip-hop was just completely like punk. It was just offensive to everyone. But someone decided somewhere it was no longer acceptable to say cracker and honky and those kind of words, but nigger was okay. And for me, when we look at who owns hip-hop, Mos Def made a song called Old White Men is running this rap shit. It's called The Rape's Over. It was on a beat, the same beat that Jay-Z made The Takeover on. And that song was taken off of his album without his label telling him, because he criticized white corporate ownership of hip-hop. He said some tall Israeli is running this rap shit, and that was taken to be anti-Semitic. Leo Cohen is tall and he's Israeli. It's a statement of fact. It wasn't anti-Semitic. He was like, that's who's in charge of rap. It's not black people. And so I think that the use of that word has become, to me, very gimmicky, has become a dangerous way of glossing over the reality of what it was to be black in America. And certainly for me, as someone whose mother's white, I don't understand the motivation for white people to want to use the word. When people are like, oh, but why can't I use it? I'm white. I'm like, first of all, why do you feel oppressed by that? I'm confused. And knowing the history, why do you want to call your black friend nigger? Let's just deal with that for a minute. Because my mum's white, and she's never had the desire to say, look at my little nigger son. So I'm confused why people want to use the word. Now, black people can figure out for ourselves whether or not we think it's intelligent to continue using the word. But why are young white kids like, I just want to call, I just want to? This comes back to your question a little bit. This perverse sort of, ooh, blackness is just a bit dangerous and it's a bit sexy and it's a bit violent. And, ooh, can I say nigger, can't I? It's a little bit of that, yeah? But I don't think a song called Honkies in Harlem would get on Radio 1. But Niggas in Paris will.
We've got time for one more question. Could we go to the question on the back row there?
Hiya. You spoke earlier about how kind of lucky and fortunate you were to go to a Sunday school, was it? Or
it was Saturday.
Saturday, where you could sort of experience a different kind of history.
Yeah.
I wanted to know what sort of specific advice would you give to, I suppose, people like me who not only have to deal with very whitewashed academia here, but back where I'm from, there's a lot of internalized kind of denial of any contribution that, you know, India or wherever made to civilization in general. Sort of dealing on both two different fronts, if you like.
Well, I think you have to, a good friend of mine who's one of the youngest, if not the youngest professor in American history, a gentleman called M.K. Asante Jr., whose dad was actually the guy who came up with the idea of Afrocentrism, interestingly enough, that theory. But his son always says, take two sets of notes. You live in the world you live in. I don't want to come here and pretend to you that I'm all depressed and everything. Everyone has a struggle. Even to be brought up in a culture that, let's be clear, to be brought up in a culture that teaches you are ethnically exceptional and then have to go to school with a Ghanaian kid who's cleverer than you is difficult. So I don't want to pretend that everyone brown has it terrible and everyone white has it wonderful. There are challenges and consequences of being brought up in a culture that pathologically tells you you're brilliant just because of the way you look. How's that going to pan out for you in the real world? It doesn't pan out so well. So I don't want to give the impression that it's all one-way traffic in that sense. If we look at suicide rates, if we look at uses of drug addiction, I grew up in working class inner city Afro-Caribbean London. I've never been to a party and seen people take heroin or cocaine. I'm not saying people don't sell cocaine or take cocaine, but you will never go to a party in Harlesden and see tables full of cocaine and ketamine and all those kinds of hard drugs that I see when I go to festivals that are problematic in a way, right? So there are issues that come for any kind of group identity. But I would say in terms of taking two sets of notes, that means you have to do what you have to do to get by in the workplace. You have to do what you have to do to survive in university. But for yourself, for your own spiritual center, for your own well-being, you have to expose yourself to a broader set of information beyond the propaganda that you're being taught. And that goes, for you as a woman, goes on many levels. You know, the history of women in science. Are we to believe that women are less intelligent? That's why there's less women in science? Of course not. And when countries like Iran and India are producing more female scientists than the UK as a percentage, we have to ask ourselves why. Because all we hear about gender relations of those countries, by the way, the Indian mission to Mars, a lot of the scientists who worked on it were women. And they did it for 10% of NASA's mission to Mars. And this was last year, right? So you can find inspiration in things that are even happening and evolving now. That's not to say that gender relations in India are all of a sudden wonderful because of that. It's to say we only hear one side of it. So I think you have to give yourself a broader picture. For me, I find a lot of solace in reading, a lot of solace in acquiring greater information. And it's not just about therapy, it's about learning these things to inform action. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke says, and I'll close with it, history is a map which tells people where they have been and where they must go. History is a clock on which people tell their cultural, political, and socio-economic time of day. So history is not just to navel gaze and say our ancestors were great, but we're not. Ah, well. It's to say, oh, this is the history, as Europe does right now. There go Greece, Rome, Enlightenment, 21st century. If you pick up a violin tomorrow and you want to learn classical music, they're going to take you to 14th century Florence. Whereas if you're a rapper, it's very unlikely that anyone's ever told you the connection to West African Malian griots, their relationship to jazz, then blues, then reggae music, and giving you that sense of continuity because it's broken history. And that's what I'm interested in rebuilding. So take 2 sets of notes.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening, but we are going to be heading into the bar, so please do come and have a drink and continue the conversation with Akala in there. Please join me in thanking Akala.
Big up. Thank you.